19th century China, a failed exam candidate came to believe he was the younger brother of Jesus. In North China, fighters prepared for war, believing ritual discipline could make them immune to bullets. In the American West, entire communities danced for the return of the dead and the restoration of a lost world. In the United States, thousands waited for a precise day when history itself was supposed to end. And in the dry interior of Brazil, a barefoot preacher led a settlement so unnerving that the state sent army after army to destroy it. These were not legends invented later. They were real movements. They gathered followers. They terrified governments. And in some cases, they left behind battlefields, massacres, and one of the deadliest conflicts of the 19th century. So how did this happen? Why did so many people, in so many distant places, begin to believe that the old world was collapsing, and that only prophecy, ritual, or divine intervention could open the next one? Because beneath the surface of the modern 19th century, something far stranger may have been unfolding. To understand why these movements appeared, we need to step back and look at the world they emerged from. The 19th century is usually remembered as the age of modernity. It was the century of steam engines, telegraphs, railways, expanding cities, and powerful empires. Factories spread across Europe and North America. Industrial production transformed economies. Steamships crossed oceans faster than ever before. Telegraph cables began to stitch continents together with near-instant communication. To many historians, this period marks the birth of the modern world. But modernization did not arrive gently. For millions of people, it arrived as disruption. Across Asia, old imperial systems were beginning to crack under pressure from foreign powers and internal instability. China's Qing dynasty, once one of the most powerful empires on earth, faced humiliating defeats in the Opium Wars and growing foreign intrusion into its ports and cities. Christian missionaries entered regions that had previously been closed to them. Foreign merchants gained influence in treaty ports, and for many ordinary people, the social and moral order that had governed life for centuries seemed to be weakening. In Persia, the Qajar state struggled with internal factionalism, foreign influence, and a religious climate already charged with expectation about the coming of a promised figure in Shia Islamic tradition. In India, the British East India Company had transformed a vast subcontinent into a colonial domain. Traditional power structures had been disrupted, economies restructured, and entire populations drawn into a new imperial system they did not control. In North America, indigenous nations were being pushed off their lands with increasing speed. Treaties were broken, buffalo herds disappeared, reservation systems compressed entire cultures into shrinking territories. Even societies that appeared politically stable were experiencing deep shifts. In the United States, waves of religious revival swept across the country in the early 19th century. Preachers traveled from town to town, proclaiming that the world was entering its final stage before divine judgment. Crowds gathered in revival meetings where emotion, prophecy, and apocalyptic expectation blended together. Meanwhile, in Latin America, newly independent nations struggled to stabilize after the collapse of colonial rule. Political systems were fragile, economies were uneven. Rural regions often existed far beyond the reach of central governments. And everywhere, information began to move faster. Printing presses multiplied, newspapers circulated widely, pamphlets carried rumors, sermons, and political messages from village to village. Telegraph wires allowed news to travel across continents in hours rather than weeks. This new media environment had a strange side effect. Ideas, especially alarming ideas, could now spread much faster than before. Rumors of miracles, stories of divine visions, predictions of apocalypse, reports of strange religious movements, all of these could move through society with unprecedented speed, and in times of uncertainty, people often searched for meaning in unusual places. Some turned to political revolutions, others turned to nationalism, but many turned somewhere else. They turned to prophecy, they turned to visions, they turned to leaders who claimed that the chaos around them was not random at all, that history itself was about to be rewritten. And this is where our story begins to change. Because the strange beliefs we saw earlier were not isolated events scattered randomly across the world. They began with individuals. Individuals who believed they had seen something others had not. Individuals who claimed that the suffering of their time was not meaningless. Individuals who insisted that a new era was coming. But something about these figures is difficult to explain, because they did not remain obscure prophets speaking to small audiences. In several cases, their ideas spread with astonishing speed. Entire communities reorganized around them. Cities were captured, empires were shaken, and governments began to respond with fear. So the next question becomes unavoidable. Who were these people? And why did so many others believe them? In the early 1830s, in a rural corner of southern China, a young man named Hong Xiuquan was preparing for an exam. At first glance, nothing about him looked extraordinary. He was the son of a modest farming family in Guangdong province. Like many ambitious young men in imperial China, he had spent years studying for the civil service examinations, the rigid system that determined who could enter the imperial bureaucracy. Passing those exams could transform a person's life. A successful candidate could rise into government service, gain prestige, and bring honor to his entire family. But the exams were brutally competitive. Every year, thousands of hopeful scholars gathered in examination halls across the empire. Only a tiny fraction succeeded. Hong Xiuquan did not. He failed once, then again, and again. But each failure was more than personal disappointment. In the social structure of Qing China, repeated failure could mean the collapse of an entire life plan. After one of these exam failures in the 1830s, Hong reportedly suffered a severe illness. For days, he drifted in and out of consciousness. During that illness, he experienced something he would later describe as a series of visions. According to his later accounts, he saw himself transported to a heavenly realm. There, an elderly figure with a golden beard, interpreted by Hong as a divine father, rebuked him for allowing demons to corrupt the world below. Hong described receiving a sword. He was told to destroy these demons. At the time, the experience remained private. Hong eventually recovered and returned to ordinary life. But several years later, something unexpected happened. He encountered a set of Christian missionary pamphlets that had been circulating in southern China. The texts contained fragments of biblical teaching translated into Chinese. As Hong read them, something clicked. He began reinterpreting the visions he had experienced during his illness. The old man in the heavens, he concluded, must have been God the Father. And the figure who stood beside him was Jesus Christ, which led Hong to a startling realization. If that figure was Jesus, then who was he? Hong reached a conclusion that would reshape Chinese history. He believed he was Jesus' younger brother, sent to Earth with a divine mission. From that moment onward, Hong's life changed. He began preaching a message that blended elements of Christianity with Chinese moral reform and apocalyptic expectation. He condemned traditional religious practices as demonic. He called for the purification of society, and he insisted that the world was entering a new sacred era. At first, the movement was small, but it did not remain small for long. Throughout the 1840s, Hong's followers began forming communities in southern China. Many were farmers and laborers, living in regions already suffering from economic instability, population pressure, and local unrest. Hong's message was radical but simple. The old order was corrupt. Demons ruled the world. But a new heavenly kingdom was coming. By 1850, that message had ignited something extraordinary. An armed movement emerged around Hong's followers. Within a few years, this movement, known today as the Taiping Rebellion, captured major cities across southern China. In 1853, Taiping forces seized the great city of Nanjing and declared it the capital of a new state. Hong Xiuquan ruled it as the leader of what he called the heavenly kingdom of great peace. This was no small uprising. At its height, the Taiping movement controlled territory containing tens of millions of people. Its armies marched across vast regions of China. Its ideology blended biblical language with revolutionary social reforms, and its war against the Qing dynasty would become one of the deadliest conflicts of the entire 19th century. Modern historians estimate that the Taiping conflict may have caused 20 to 30 million deaths. All of it began with one man's visions, one man who believed he had been chosen by heaven. But this is where the story becomes even more puzzling, because Hong Xiuquan was not the only person in the 19th century who claimed a divine mission, and he was not the only one whose claims attracted massive followings. Across the world, in entirely different cultures, other figures were beginning to say things that sounded eerily similar. Some promised the end of the old world. Some promised the restoration of a lost one. Some promised protection through ritual. Others set exact dates for the end of history itself. And again, people believed them. So the question becomes harder to ignore. Why did figures like Hong Xiuquan appear in the first place? And why did so many others soon follow? Because if Hong's story were unique, it might simply be dismissed as an extraordinary anomaly. But it was not unique. In fact, it may have been the beginning of a pattern. If Hong Xiuquan's story were the only one of its kind, it might be easy to explain. A failed scholar, a series of visions during illness, a charismatic leader who convinced thousands of followers. History has always produced individuals like that. But what makes the 19th century unusual is that stories like Hong's were not confined to one place. They began appearing again and again in societies that had little direct connection to one another. And in each case, the pattern looked strangely familiar. Persia, 1844. In the city of Shiraz, in what is now Iran, a young merchant named Mirza Ali Muhammad made an extraordinary declaration. It was the evening of May 23rd, 1844. To a visiting religious student, the merchant revealed that he was not an ordinary believer. He claimed to be the Bab, meaning the gate. In Shia Islamic tradition, there existed a powerful expectation. One day, a divinely guided figure known as the Mahdi would appear to restore justice to the world. The Bab's claim was ambiguous but explosive. He presented himself as the gateway to a new era of divine revelation. Word of his message spread quickly through Persia. Followers gathered. Debates erupted among scholars and clerics. And as the movement expanded, so did alarm within the Qajar state. Within a few years, tensions between Babi followers and authorities escalated into open conflict. The Bab himself was eventually executed in 1850. But the movement he inspired didn't vanish. Instead, it transformed, evolving into religious traditions that would continue to shape global history long after his death. The United States, 1844. In the same year the Bab made his declaration in Persia, something else was happening on the other side of the world. In the northeastern United States, a former soldier turned preacher named William Miller had spent years studying biblical prophecy. Miller believed he had discovered something hidden in the scriptures. By carefully calculating the symbolic timelines in the book of Daniel, he concluded that Christ would return to earth very soon. At first, his prediction was vague, but over time, his followers began focusing on a specific date, October 22nd, 1844. On that day, many believed history would end. Thousands of Millerites gathered in churches, fields, and homes. Some sold their possessions. Some prepared spiritually for the final moment. But the day came, and the world didn't end. The event became known as the Great Disappointment. For many believers, it was devastating, but for historians, it remains something else. A remarkable example of how strongly people could commit to the belief that history itself was about to break open. The American West, 1889. Several decades later, another prophetic message appeared among indigenous communities in the western United States. A Paiute spiritual leader named Wovoka reported experiencing a vision during a solar eclipse. In that vision, he said, God showed him a world transformed. If people lived peacefully and performed a sacred dance, he explained, the world would soon be renewed. The dead would return. Buffalo herds would come back, and the suffering brought by colonization would disappear. The ritual he taught became known as the ghost dance. Word spread rapidly across Native American communities, living under the crushing conditions of reservation life. For many participants, the dance was not simply a religious ceremony. It was hope. Hope that the destruction of their world might somehow be reversed. But the movement alarmed US authorities. Officials feared that the gatherings might become a rebellion. The tension surrounding the ghost dance would eventually contribute to the tragic events at Wounded Knee in 1890. China again, 1899. Near the end of the century, another strange movement emerged in northern China. Foreign missionaries, merchants, and soldiers had been entering the country in growing numbers. Resentment spread among rural communities already suffering from economic hardship and natural disasters. In this atmosphere, secretive martial groups began practicing rituals that combined physical training, spiritual possession, and religious symbolism. Western observers later called them the Boxers. Some participants believed that through spiritual discipline and ritual, they could become invulnerable to bullets. To outside observers, the idea seemed irrational. But within the context of invasion, humiliation, and fear, the belief carried a powerful emotional force. When Boxer groups began attacking foreign institutions and Christian converts, the crisis escalated rapidly. Soon, an international coalition of armies would march into China. Brazil, 1890s. Meanwhile, on another continent entirely, something very different but oddly familiar was unfolding. In the harsh interior of northeastern Brazil, a wandering preacher named Antonio Conselheiro began attracting followers. Conselheiro lived simply. He preached repentance, moral reform, and devotion to God. But he also rejected the legitimacy of Brazil's newly established republican government. Around him, thousands of poor farmers, former slaves, and displaced laborers gathered to form a settlement called Canudos. To outsiders, the community seemed strange and threatening. Officials feared it was becoming a rebellious state within a state. The Brazilian government sent military expeditions to destroy it. The first expeditions failed. Then more soldiers were sent. Finally, in 1897, the settlement was crushed in a brutal campaign that left the community in ruins. At first glance, these stories appear unrelated. Different continents, different religions, different cultures, different languages. But as we place them next to each other, certain similarities begin to appear. Again and again, we see a prophetic figure, a moment of crisis, a promise that the world is about to change, a community forming around that promise, and a government that responds with fear. But is this really a pattern? Or are we simply forcing connections between unrelated events? To answer that, we need to look more closely at how these movements were interpreted by the people who witnessed them. Because something about the historical record does not quite add up. And the more we examine it, the stranger the story becomes. Faith, fear, or something deeper. By this point in the story, the pattern begins to feel difficult to ignore. Across the 19th century, in places that had little direct contact with one another, remarkably similar movements appeared. A prophetic figure emerges. The world seems to be falling apart. A new sacred order is promised. Followers gather. Authorities become alarmed. But what explains this repetition? Historians have debated that question for generations, and the answers are not simple. Explanation 1. Religious tradition. The most straightforward explanation is also the oldest. In many societies, traditions already existed that expected some kind of future transformation. In Christianity, there were centuries of teachings about the second coming of Christ. In Shia Islam, believers anticipated the eventual arrival of the Mahdi, a divinely guided figure who would restore justice. In Chinese religious culture, cycles of dynastic collapse and heavenly renewal were deeply embedded in historical memory. Even among indigenous cultures in North America, prophetic traditions sometimes emerged in response to profound disruption. From this perspective, the movements we have been exploring were not entirely new. They were reinterpretations of older ideas. When Hong Xiuquan read fragments of Christian missionary texts, he interpreted them through his own experiences and cultural framework. When the Bab declared a new era of revelation, his message resonated with centuries of expectation surrounding a promised guide. William Miller's prediction of 1844 emerged from a long Protestant tradition of biblical interpretation and millennial speculation, and Wovoka's ghost dance drew on existing spiritual practices while responding to the devastation of indigenous life in the American West. In other words, the seeds of these movements already existed. The 19th century did not invent prophetic belief. It simply provided new circumstances in which those beliefs could grow. But this explanation leaves an important question unanswered. Why did these traditions suddenly become so powerful during this particular century? Why did so many people believe that their own moment in history was the moment when everything would change? Explanation 2. Crisis and collapse. A second explanation looks less at theology and more at historical conditions. Many of these movements appeared during periods of intense instability. China in the mid-19th century was suffering from economic strain, population pressure, corruption, and the humiliations of foreign intrusion. In Persia, tensions between religious authorities and the state were already simmering. Indigenous nations in North America were experiencing catastrophic loss of land, resources, and autonomy. Rural populations in Brazil's interior faced poverty, drought, and social marginalization. In such environments, prophecy can serve a powerful social function. It provides meaning, it explains suffering, and most importantly, it offers hope that the current order, however unjust it may appear, will not last forever. From this perspective, prophetic movements are not irrational responses to crisis. They are deeply human responses. When ordinary political solutions seem impossible, people sometimes turn toward cosmic ones, a new kingdom, a divine intervention, a world restored. But even this explanation has limits, because crisis alone does not automatically produce prophetic leaders. Many societies endure hardship without generating large-scale religious movements. Something else must be happening. Explanation 3. The power of charismatic individuals. Another line of interpretation focuses on the personalities of the leaders themselves. Figures like Hong Xiuquan, the Barb, Wovoka, William Miller, and Antonio Consolero were not simply passive reflections of social pressure. They were charismatic communicators. They offered clear explanations in moments when many people felt lost. They spoke with conviction about invisible realities. And in some cases, they created new religious frameworks that blended older traditions with innovative ideas. Charisma can be difficult to measure historically, but it can be powerful. A persuasive leader can transform scattered anxieties into organized movements. A vision, once articulated clearly enough, can spread with surprising speed. But charisma alone still does not explain the broader pattern, because charismatic individuals appear throughout history. What seems unusual about the 19th century is not just that such individuals existed, but that so many movements formed around them in such a short span of time. Explanation 4. The shock of modernity. Some historians suggest that the answer may lie in the strange psychological effects of rapid transformation. The 19th century was not simply another century. It was one of the fastest periods of global change humanity had ever experienced. Technologies appeared that would have seemed unimaginable only a generation earlier. Steam power reshaped transportation. Telegraphs collapsed distances. Industrial production altered entire economies. At the same time, colonial empires expanded aggressively into regions that had previously remained relatively autonomous. For many communities, the pace of change was overwhelming. Old traditions lost authority. New systems of power appeared suddenly. Entire ways of life disappeared within decades. In such moments, people often search for explanations that are larger than politics or economics. They search for meaning in cosmic narratives. The language of prophecy, apocalypse, and divine intervention becomes one way of making sense of a world that seems to be transforming too quickly to understand. But even this interpretation does not solve every mystery. Because if rapid change produces prophetic movements, why do we not see them everywhere at all times? Why do they cluster in certain moments and places? And why do governments so often respond to them with fear? The unresolved question. By now, the pattern should feel familiar. Each explanation captures part of the story. Religious traditions create expectations. Historical crises intensify emotions. Charismatic leaders give those emotions a voice. Rapid social change destabilizes the sense of reality. Together, these forces can produce movements that appear strange in retrospect, but perfectly logical to the people living through them. And yet something still lingers. Because when we look at the archives of the 19th century, we encounter another layer of mystery. The sources themselves are often contradictory. Government reports describe dangerous fanaticism. Missionary accounts describe spiritual delusion. Newspapers describe bizarre rituals and irrational crowds. But when historians examine the movements more closely, those descriptions sometimes begin to look exaggerated or misunderstood. or shaped by fear, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if part of the strangeness of these movements does not come from the believers themselves, but from the way the world around them reacted? To explore that possibility, we need to examine the historical evidence more closely. Because the deeper we look into the records of the 19th century, the more we discover that these stories were not only about prophecy, they were also about power. What the records actually show, to understand these movements more clearly, historians often turn to the surviving evidence of the time, not the legends that developed later, not the simplified stories that appear in textbooks, but the raw materials of history itself: newspapers, military reports, missionary letters, government proclamations, personal memoirs, court records. And when those sources are placed side by side, something interesting begins to appear. The movements we have been discussing were often described in strikingly similar language, the language of alarm. Take the Taiping movement in China. When reports about Hong Xiuquan's followers began reaching Qing officials, they were frequently described as dangerous fanatics. Foreign observers, including missionaries and diplomats, sometimes portrayed the Taiping as a bizarre hybrid of Christianity and rebellion. Yet when historians later examined Taiping documents themselves, proclamations, hymns, administrative records, they discovered something more complex. The Taiping state had structured leadership. It issued policies. It organized armies and taxation systems. It was not merely a chaotic religious uprising. It was a competing political order built around religious legitimacy. A similar pattern appears in accounts of the Boxer movement. Western newspapers often depicted Boxers as irrational mobs, convinced that magical rituals made them invulnerable. But when researchers later examined Chinese sources, the picture looked more nuanced. Boxer groups practiced martial rituals that blended spiritual symbolism with physical discipline. Belief in divine protection did exist, but the movement also functioned as a form of rural self-organization against foreign encroachment. In other words, what appeared in Western reports as pure superstition also contained elements of political resistance. The ghost dance in the archive. The case of the ghost dance reveals the same tension between interpretation and reality. US military authorities and many journalists feared that the ghost dance signaled an imminent uprising among indigenous nations. Large gatherings of dancers seemed threatening. Rumors circulated that sacred shirts worn during the ritual could stop bullets. But anthropologists and historians who studied the movement more carefully found that many participants understood the ritual differently. For many, the ghost dance was not a preparation for war. It was a prayer, a ritual expression of hope that the devastation of their world might somehow be undone. Yet fear transformed that hope into a perceived military threat, and that perception helped create the climate that led to the tragedy at Wounded Knee in 1890. Brazil's war against Canudos. Perhaps the clearest example of this pattern appears in Brazil. When journalists first reported on the community of Canudos, the descriptions were dramatic. Newspapers warned of a dangerous fanatic settlement in the interior. They portrayed Antonio Conselheiro's followers as a rebellious cult preparing to overthrow the Republic. Those reports spread quickly across the country. Public alarm grew. Military expeditions were organized. But after the destruction of Canudos in 1897, a Brazilian journalist named Euclides da Cunha traveled to the region to investigate what had actually happened. His famous book, Os Sertões, Rebellion in the Backlands, presented a far more complicated story. The community of Canudos was indeed deeply religious, but many of its residents were simply poor farmers seeking stability in a harsh environment. What outsiders saw as fanaticism was in many cases a form of communal survival. Yet by the time that interpretation emerged, the settlement had already been annihilated, a pattern in the records. When historians compare these different archives, China, Persia, the United States, Brazil, certain similarities begin to stand out. In many cases, prophetic movements arose during moments of severe social disruption. Leaders framed suffering as part of a cosmic transformation. Followers gathered around shared rituals and moral reform. Governments interpreted those gatherings as threats, and newspapers amplified the sense of danger. This pattern does not mean that every movement was misunderstood. Some did become violent. Some did challenge political authority. But the historical record suggests that the reactions of states and observers were often shaped by fear, uncertainty, and unfamiliarity with the beliefs they were witnessing, which leads to a fascinating possibility. Perhaps what makes these movements appear so strange today is not only the beliefs themselves, it is also the way those beliefs were filtered through the anxieties of the 19th century. And if that is true, then the real mystery may lie somewhere deeper than the movements alone. Because when we place all these stories together, Hong Xiuquan, the Barb, the Ghost Dance, the Boxers, the Millerites, Canudos, they begin to form a different kind of picture. A picture of a century filled with upheaval. A century where millions of people experienced the collapse of familiar worlds. And when worlds collapse, people do not always respond with political theories or economic analysis. Sometimes they respond with prophecy, which brings us to the final question of this investigation. If these movements were not isolated curiosities, what do they reveal about the deeper emotional landscape of the 19th century? The hidden crisis beneath the modern century. When we look back at the 19th century, the story we usually tell is one of progress. It is the century of railways and steamships, of factories and expanding cities, of telegraph wires stretching across oceans and continents. It is the century when the modern world seemed to take shape. But the movements we have explored suggest that something else was happening at the same time. Beneath the surface of industrial progress and imperial expansion, many societies were experiencing something closer to spiritual dislocation. Entire ways of life were disappearing. Traditional authorities were weakening. Old political orders were collapsing under the pressure of modern warfare, colonial expansion, and economic transformation. For many communities, the world they had known no longer made sense. And when that happens, people often search for meaning beyond ordinary politics. They look for signs. They look for visions. They look for explanations that connect their suffering to a larger story. In that sense, the prophetic movements of the 19th century may not be historical accidents at all. They may represent a recurring human response to moments when history moves too quickly. Hong Xiuquan saw divine visions in the ruins of a broken examination system. The Barb's message spread through a Persia already alive with expectation about a coming guide. William Miller's followers waited for the end of the world in a country swept by waves of religious revival. The Ghost Dance emerged among peoples whose worlds had been shattered by colonization. The Boxers fought in a China humiliated by foreign intrusion. And in Brazil's backlands, the people of Canudos gathered around a preacher who promised that divine justice still existed in a world that seemed to have forgotten them. Each movement was unique. Each had its own theology, its own leaders, its own local circumstances. But together, they reveal something that standard narratives of the 19th century often overlook. Modernity did not simply produce railroads and factories. It also produced uncertainty, dislocation, fear, and an intense intense hunger for meaning. Seen from that perspective, the century begins to look different. Not just an age of machines and empires, but also an age of prophets. So what do these stories ultimately tell us? Perhaps they remind us that history is rarely as orderly as it appears in textbooks. The 19th century built the foundations of the modern world, but for millions of people living through it, the experience may have felt far less stable. Old worlds were collapsing, new powers were rising, and in the middle of that turbulence, people searched for answers. Some found those answers in political revolutions, some found them in science, and some found them in visions of divine transformation. Today, those beliefs can appear strange from a distance, but the deeper we look into the archives of the time, the more they begin to feel like something else. Not merely anomalies, but signals. Signals that the birth of the modern world was also accompanied by a profound crisis of meaning. And that raises one final question. If the 19th century was not only the age of industry and empire, but also an age of prophecy, what does that say about the human response to upheaval in any century? Perhaps the real mystery is not why these movements appeared. Perhaps the real mystery is why they appear whenever the world begins to change too fast for people to understand it.